The funeral was almost over when the church doors creaked open. No one expected a visitor, let alone one on 4 legs. A muddy, aging German shepherd walked down the aisle, silent, steady, eyes locked on the coffin. He didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the front and laid his head gently on the polished wood of his master's coffin. And then he refused to leave. Not for 1 day, not for 2, but for 6 cold nights. And what this old dog did next, when the town caught fire, left the entire country in tears. Would your dog do the same? Tell us your city. And if you've ever had a dog this loyal. It was a crisp October morning in the quiet village of Windermere, just north of Devon, in the English countryside. The church bells of St. Albans tolled solemnly, echoing through the mist-covered fields and over the stone cottages, like a slow, grieving heartbeat. The leaves had just begun their annual dance, rust-colored, gold-edged, and brittle, with the promise of winter. Inside the old stone church, friends and family had gathered to say goodbye to a man many in the village considered a pillar of quiet strength. Edward Mallory, 78 years old, a retired postman, a widower of 20 years, and a World War II historian whose calm demeanor and warm smile had made him a fixture at the village bookshop, Sunday service, and the corner bench by the bakery. Edward had lived alone since his wife Elsie passed, but he was never truly alone. For nearly 10 years, his constant companion had been a large, aging German shepherd named Brutus, a dog he rescued from an animal shelter in Exeter. The bond between them was something the villagers often spoke of with quiet envy and reverence. Brutus walked Edward to the market, waited by the pew every Sunday, and even sat in the corner of the book club Edward had attended every month, looking like a well-read guardian. But as the casket was wheeled gently to the front of the altar, no one expected what came next. The church doors, those tall, thick oaken panels, groaned open with a dramatic creak, halting the minister mid-sentence. Heads turned, some startled, some assuming it was a latecomer. But what stepped through the doorway wasn't a person. It was Brutus. His fur was wet from the drizzle, paws muddy from the graveyard lawn, but his stance, proud, steady, unapologetically determined. He didn't sniff, he didn't bark, he didn't even look around the room. He walked straight, unwavering, to the front of the church, where Edward's coffin lay. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the slow tap of his nails against the stone floor. People parted instinctively, watching in disbelief as the old dog reached the coffin, sat down beside it, and placed his head gently on the polished wood and refused to move. The vicar, caught mid-prayer, could only stare. Muffled gasps were heard. A few elderly women clutched handkerchiefs tighter. Someone in the back whispered, "It's like he knew." He did know, and he wasn't leaving. The funeral was frozen in a surreal kind of silence. People glanced around, unsure whether to continue or wait. Even the vicar, Reverend Lawrence, an even-tempered man in his 60s, stood there, with his reading glasses perched halfway down his nose, eyes locked on the grieving dog. Eventually, it was Edward's niece, Margaret, who broke the tension. A silver-haired woman in her early 70s, wearing a lavender coat and deeply lined hands that had once braided daisies into her uncle's garden fence. She stood and whispered, "Let him be." The funeral resumed, but nothing was the same. Every word of remembrance, every tear shed by a friend or former neighbor felt deeper, somehow more real, because there was Brutus, as still as stone, eyes closed now, but not asleep, as if he was listening, as if he understood every word spoken about the man who'd once carried him home from a cage and called him old boy every morning since. No one tried to move him, no one dared. When the final hymn ended and the pallbearers rose to carry the casket out toward the burial ground behind the chapel, something happened that chilled every witness. to the bone. Brutus stood, slowly, painfully, and walked beside the casket, step for step. He had never been trained for ceremonies, never taught to heal beside a coffin, but somehow he knew. And when they lowered Edward Mallory into the earth, Brutus lay down beside the grave and refused to leave. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, the kind that seeps into wool coats and wets the rim of a felt hat. Most of the attendees had trickled away, murmuring condolences, dabbing their eyes. Only Margaret and Reverend Lawrence remained, standing beneath a large umbrella, hearts torn between grief and awe. "Should we try to take him?" Margaret asked gently. The Reverend shook his head. "I think he's where he wants to be." Brutus didn't whine, didn't cry. He simply lay, head over his paws, beside the fresh mound of earth, ears twitching now and then at distant crows. Hours passed. The grave diggers, out of respect, left him be. The groundskeeper brought out a tartan blanket from the vestry and gently laid it beside the dog, whispering, "For your bones, lad." Brutus didn't stir. By nightfall, someone had lit a lantern near the gravesite. Others brought food and a water bowl, but no one could coax him away, not even Margaret, who knelt beside him and whispered, "He's gone, love. You don't have to wait." But the dog did. He waited through the night, through the cold, through the next morning, and the day after that. News began to spread. Locals posted pictures. Loyal shepherd keeps vigil beside owner's grave. It reached the regional papers, the national news. Even the BBC did a small piece. But for the people of Windermere, this wasn't about headlines. It was about heartbreak and love, and something most of them had never seen before. Not like this. 3 days after the funeral, Margaret returned to the cemetery with an old leather box she'd retrieved from Edward's home. Brutus was still there, a little thinner, a little stiffer, but still there. She sat beside him on the grass and opened the box. Inside were photographs, most of Edward with Brutus, some of Brutus as a younger dog, bounding through meadows, tugging at a rope toy, in Edward's modest garden. But one picture, creased at the corners, caught Margaret's breath. It was taken nearly a decade ago. Edward stood in front of the Exeter shelter, a younger Brutus sitting awkwardly beside him. A sign behind them read, "Last day for adoption." Margaret remembered the story now. Edward had gone in, just to look. He came out with Brutus. No one wanted him, he had said. Too old, too serious looking. But Edward had seen something, and now Brutus, too old, too serious looking, too loyal, refused to leave his side. Margaret leaned her head against the old shepherd's back, tears falling silently. "You were never just a dog, were you?" Brutus didn't move, because his answer, like his devotion, was in the silence. On the 5th morning, frost dusted the grass like powdered sugar, and a stillness hung over the cemetery that seemed deeper than before. A few early risers from the village, Mr. Henley the baker, Mrs. Pratchett from the flower shop, and even young Samuel from the post office, stood quietly by the wrought iron fence, looking in on Brutus. He was still there. His once proud back sagged a little more, his muzzle whiter than before, yet there was a nobility in his stillness, a loyalty that brought a lump to every throat that witnessed it. Margaret returned that morning, carrying a thermos of warm broth and a biscuit wrapped in cloth. She crouched beside the dog and gently lifted his bowl. Brutus sniffed at the broth, but didn't touch it. Still, he gave a soft sigh, as if acknowledging the gesture. Then Margaret did something she hadn't dared before. She spoke to the earth. "Uncle Edward," she whispered, voice trembling, "you left something behind. He doesn't know how to carry on without you." She waited. No sign, no movement, just the wind rustling through the dried leaves. Then something strange happened. From the pocket of her coat, She pulled out a weathered envelope she'd found hidden in Edward's writing desk. On the front, in looping, steady handwriting, were 4 words: "In the event of Brutus." Margaret blinked in confusion. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single-page letter, written nearly 2 years ago. "To whomever finds this, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. But more importantly, it means Brutus is alone. I worry more for him than I ever have for myself. He has been more than a dog. He has been a guardian, a listener, a reminder that love does not vanish with age or grief or even death. If he is still at my grave, do not force him away. But tell him, if you can, that I am not in that box. I am with Elsie now, and someday he'll be with us too. But until then, it's okay to live. Tell him to live. Yours with a full heart, Edward." Tears rolled freely down Margaret's cheeks. She folded the letter carefully, then looked to Brutus. His amber eyes were on her, steady and deep. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "He says you can live now." And for the first time in days, Brutus moved. He leaned his head against Margaret's knee, not to beg, not to rest, but to let go just a little. Margaret knew she couldn't take Brutus back to the empty house. That place belonged to memories now, dusted furniture, quiet bookshelves, and a radio that hadn't played since Edward passed. She wanted Brutus to be somewhere warm, alive, surrounded by people who still had chapters to write. She took him home with her. Her cottage on Lavender Hill was small but cozy, with creaky stairs and a warm hearth. Brutus sniffed the corners with wary caution, as if checking for permission. He stood by the door for almost 10 minutes, ears perked toward the distance, waiting. But that night, as the wind howled through the chimneys, Brutus curled beside Margaret's armchair and slept deeply. In the morning, she woke to find him sitting by the front door, looking out, not trying to leave, just remembering. Over the next week, Brutus began to change. He still didn't eat much, but he followed Margaret from room to room. He sat beside her as she read Edward's old books. And sometimes, when she played the old phonograph, in the corner, Edward's favorite records, Brutus would let out a low, thoughtful sound, almost like a hum. One afternoon, as the two sat, watching the fire, Margaret said aloud, "You miss him every day." "Don't you?" Brutus didn't move. She smiled gently. "So do I." That evening, Brutus did something unexpected. As Margaret laid out her knitting beside the chair, he stood, walked to her side, and dropped something on her lap. A worn leather slipper. Edward's. Margaret stared at it, then at Brutus. "You held on to this?" He looked up at her, tail giving a slow, single wag. For the first time in days, Margaret laughed. Not a full laugh, but enough. As the weeks passed, word continued to spread. What began as whispers in Windermere became a story, passed along dinner tables in Devon, then up through Yorkshire, across the pond, to Canada, and even to small towns in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Letters began to arrive, some addressed simply to Brutus the Loyal Dog, Windermere, UK. Children sent drawings. Elderly couples wrote about their own dogs long gone. Widows who had known the pain of quiet houses shared poems. One man, a retired fireman from Toronto, sent a photo of his shepherd, Max, with a note, "They never really leave us, neither the dogs nor the ones who loved them." The village post office had to dedicate a box just for Brutus's mail, but Brutus didn't know. He was famous. He just knew Edward was gone, and that Margaret now read him the letters aloud every afternoon. One Sunday, the vicar held a special service, not just for Edward, but in honor of the faithful companion who showed us all what loyalty means. Brutus was there, front pew, wearing Edward's old scarf. When the congregation sang, "Abide with me," many eyes were not on the hymn books, but on the dog, who sat so still, as if understanding every note. Some say they saw his ears twitch at Edward's favorite verse. Others say they heard the pews creak with the presence of more than the living. Thank you. Now continuing from, it was the 11th of November, Remembrance Day, with the same emotionally resonant rhythm, rich in humanity, pauses, and warmth, crafted for high audience retention among your 65-plus listeners. It was the 11th of November, Remembrance Day, and the village of Windermere was gathered in the churchyard, under grey skies and stiff poppies pinned to their lapels. The brass band played low and mournful as the names of the fallen echoed from the church steps. Brutus stood quietly beside Margaret, who held his leash loosely, more for ritual than control. He'd never strayed far now. At exactly 11 o'clock, the 2-minute silence began. And then, as if time itself were holding its breath, a sudden distant crack shattered the stillness. A sharp pop, like a rifle, then another. But it wasn't a gun, it was fire. A plume of black smoke was rising from the east end of the village, near the old parish barn, where the scouts stored their camping equipment and flags. 100 heads turned. Someone screamed. Within seconds, the gathering broke into murmurs. People fumbling for phones, others running toward the smoke. Margaret clutched Brutus's leash and moved, as quickly as her knees allowed. The fire had spread fast. The barn, dry from a month without rain, was engulfed. But what panicked the villagers most wasn't the structure. It was the knowledge that inside were crates of ceremonial items and paper archives. But more importantly, young Noah Treadwell, the scout leader's son, had been playing nearby. And he hadn't come out. Chaos erupted. The fire brigade was minutes away, but the flames were already licking the surrounding hedgerows. The heat was intense. People shouted instructions. No one could hear. Margaret stood frozen until Brutus pulled at the leash. He saw the flames. He smelled the danger. And without hesitation, he lunged forward, snapping the leash clean from Margaret's hand. "Brutus," she cried. But he was already gone, barreling through the crowd, dodging grown men, ignoring the calls and panic. He ran straight into the smoke, straight into the fire. Inside the barn, the air was thick and choking. Wooden beams crackled and popped as the roof sagged. The fire hissed as it consumed every corner. Somewhere near the back, huddled behind an overturned table, was Noah, a red-haired boy of 10, coughing and crying. Into his sleeve, trapped. He had tried to get out, but the back exit was blocked. He could barely breathe. And then, through the swirling smoke, came the low, unmistakable growl of a shepherd's bark. Brutus, the boy, wheezed. The dog appeared, like a ghost, through the haze, soot-covered, eyes wild, but focused. He nudged Noah with his nose, barked once more, then grabbed the boy's sleeve with his teeth and pulled. The boy stumbled up, coughing violently. Brutus led him, weaving around collapsed beams, guiding with every instinct in his soul. Just as they reached the door, a flaming timber fell. Brutus shoved Noah forward, with his shoulder hard, sending the boy tumbling out of the doorway. The villagers gasped as Noah rolled into the grass, covered in ash, tears streaking down his cheeks. But Brutus didn't follow. He was trapped behind the fallen beam. Margaret screamed. No! The firemen had arrived by then, spraying down the barn with jets of foam. One man darted inside, only to be pushed back by heat. And then, a miracle. Brutus emerged through a side crawl space, coughing, limping, burned, but alive. The crowd erupted into cheers and sobs. People rushed forward, but Margaret got there first, kneeling in the mud, wrapping her arms around his smoky, soot-covered frame. "You saved him," she whispered, shaking. "You saved the boy." Brutus licked her cheek once and collapsed into her arms. Brutus survived the fire, but he was never quite the same. He walked slower now, slept longer, and sometimes he stared off into the distance, like he was listening to a voice. Only he could hear, the vet said. The burns were healing, but Margaret suspected something deeper had shifted. Brutus had given everything, twice. Once to Edward, and once to the boy. And now he was tired. The village of Windermere didn't forget. A year later, in the same cemetery where Edward was buried, a ceremony was held. The mayor, a portly man with silver hair and teary eyes, unveiled a bronze statue on a limestone pedestal. It was Brutus, head bowed, sitting beside a carved replica of Edward's walking stick. The plaque read, "To Brutus, who waited, who loved, and who saved. Loyalty never dies." Margaret sat in the front row, holding a framed photo of Edward in her lap. Beside her, Brutus lay peacefully. The village choir sang softly. Children placed flowers at the base of the statue. And at the back, young Noah stood silently, holding his scout uniform cap over his heart. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lanterns flickered to life, around the churchyard, Brutus passed away in his sleep, curled at Margaret's feet, as if simply stepping into the next chapter. He was buried beside Edward, and the whole village came, not just for a dog, but for what he stood for. Even after his passing, the letters didn't stop. The post office continued to receive them. Cards, sketches, stories. Children wrote about how they hugged their own dogs tighter. Veterans wrote about loyalty and grief and quiet, dignified bravery. Margaret created a scrapbook titled "For Brutus from the World." It grew so large, it needed its own shelf. One letter came from Maine. "Dear Brutus, I'm 83. I lost my husband 5 years ago. But after I saw your story on the news, I adopted a shepherd from the shelter. Her name is Nora. She's a little wild, but every time I look into her eyes, I remember your story. Thank you for reminding me to love again." Another came from Kent. "Dear Brutus, when my son died, I stopped going to church. But after hearing about your vigil, I returned last Sunday. It helped. Just thought you should know the scrapbook traveled. It was displayed in schools, libraries, even a retirement home in Nova Scotia, because loyalty like Brutus's didn't belong to one village. It belonged to everyone." Years later, the statue still stands. Children still visit on class trips. Couples pause during afternoon walks. Someone always leaves a flower, a dog treat, or a folded note. On the anniversary of Edward's funeral, Margaret, now nearing 90, returned with a walking stick and a small bench cushion. She sat beside the grave, touched the bronze head of the statue, and said, "I'll see you both soon." She stayed there. An hour before she left, she placed something at the foot of the grave. Edward's slipper, Brutus's favorite, and walked away, slowly but without sorrow, because she knew loyalty never dies and love never forgets.